Hello everyone and welcome to the Hub, the series of webinars brought to you by the AQR. I'm Ken Parker, the chair of the AQR, and I'm delighted to have Peter Totman sitting next to me, and he's going to be the star of this occasion. Peter has been on the AQR board for a long time now. In fact, I think he's our second longest serving member. He's a very strong qualitative research practitioner and is a regular speaker. In fact, he was only speaking at the MRS conference yesterday on a different subject. Peter is renowned for keeping us on the straight and narrow, and so today's topic reflects just that, the power of the ethical perspective. The talk takes around 30 minutes, and without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Peter.
Thank you very much, Ken. Welcome to the webinar, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about the power of the ethical perspective, as Ken said. And as you can see from the front page here, I'm talking quite grandiose language about the effect that this webinar could possibly have on your lives, and obviously partly tongue-in-cheek, or wholly tongue-in-cheek, I hope to say. But the problem with ethics, I think, is that you have to grab people's attention. It's not necessarily, to be honest, a subject that gets blood pumping in its own right. And I think, let's go to the core of the problem then. When you actually think of professional ethics, what kind of images tend to come to your mind? Well, I wonder whether it will be this sort of imagery. Maybe a dry and crusty old committee, the guy with the pipe there, that could easily be me at the committee meeting at the AQR, maybe Ken to the right there and Simon Passon to the left. But in all honesty, that is not what we look like, guys. And what we want to get over to you today is ethics is very different from this. It's not about chatting about very dry subjects like, for example, there's one here that came to mind in my mind from my early days as a kind of market research professional. I overheard a conversation, a very kind of passionate conversation about whether incentives could be paid in booch vouchers or not, and people have very strong views about that, believe it or not. But that's not really what ethics is about for me. And what I really want to kind of demonstrate more than anything else today is that ethics and having a professional ethical perspective is far more important, far more immediate, and even liberating. So how is it important? It's important on a number of levels. I think it's important personally for us as individuals. Because if you kind of think back to when you first started in research, and there's a picture of a very young man there, looking very keen, enthusiastic and idealistic even. When you first went into market research, what is it that you went in research for? And I think if you do think back, and you do so kind of realistically and accurately, you'll realise that it wasn't really to build brands, it wasn't really to kind of work out strategies. What it was probably about, and I have asked this question to recent graduates in market research and in quality in particular, what they tend to say, the reason they got into the business was really because they're interested in people. And sometimes they'll talk about having a curiosity about people. Some are even more idealistic and will actually talk about the fact that they want people to have a say in the products and things and the services that impact their life. There's a real idealism there. And I really think that asking yourself why you got into research in the first place is a really powerful question to ask yourself. It is a kind of reminder of what is really important to you. And what I'm going to argue today is that ethics is a way, in a sense, of actually reconnecting with this younger self, because you can actually tap back into that idealism and remind yourself why you got in the business in the first place, and that was because of people and your interest in people. So it's really interesting for us personally. Now I also think that qualitative research ethics is important to us as researchers. And there's something very dull sounding, I think, about professional reputation and that sort of thing. So I'm going to try and put it in a bit more personal language. I think that, well, let me put it very personally, if you're having that pub conversation that we all have, or dinner party, depending on what social class you move in, but if you're having that conversation when that dreaded question comes up, doesn't it? What do you do for a living? you might say I'm a researcher or a qualitative researcher. There's a look of blank on the face of the listener. And they, or worse, they even actually suggest or imagine that you're one of those people that hang around the street corners and harass people on Saturday mornings. That's the first barrier you tend to face when you have that conversation. Once you explain that you're in the business of group discussions, another barrier comes up, and that is that kind of cynicism that people have for the focus group, if you like. And this comes from TV shows like The Apprentice, but also from the kind of disengagement with the political the political kind of system, which kind of seem to use groups to suit their own purposes. So if we can together, and you individually can actually help improve the reputation of qualitative research, you can avoid some of those really awkward conversations. Most important of all about what I think makes having an ethical perspective so important, and hopefully this is the most surprising thing about our chat today, that it's linked to effectiveness on the job. Let me talk a little bit about what I mean by that. I think most people, and researchers come from a lot of different backgrounds and they have lots of different kind of belief systems about what quality research should be. But I think one thing we tend to have in common is we tend to emphasise the importance and the value of our relationships with our respondents. That's the heart of what we do. And I think that ethics is really an investment in that relationship. Because if you put people at the centre of everything you do, put your respondents at the heart of the process, their care, their comfort, the fact that they know what's going on, what's happening to them, if you make that the centre of the process, what you actually do is create that, that environment where people feel comfortable, where people actually start to open up more, where people actually feel they can speak without fear of judgment. So I think research ethics is absolutely fundamental for actually creating the kind of environment where people are more likely to talk from the heart and more likely to reveal insights. Ethics is also about effectiveness, I think, in another way. One of the most important things I believe a qualitative researcher needs to have is a self-awareness, to ask him or herself questions about why they're doing what they're doing on a kind of bigger and a kind of everyday level, constantly challenging themselves. And I think ethics is a really good way of becoming attuned to your own real motives, but also kind of thinking about what other people might be thinking and what they might be thinking of the process, for example, and how that might impact what the respondents are saying and revealing in the session. So if we actually think ethically, we start to think about why we're doing things, how people are responding a certain way and why. And really, it leads to that path, the golden ambition, which is self-awareness. So that's why ethics is important. But what is it, ethics, and where do we get our ethics from? Now, what most people tend to imagine, I think, is that there's some kind of Bible or 10 commandments of qualitative ethical practice. And it may have some of the things this document in front of me has on it. For example, it might talk about informed consent, it might talk about kind of maintaining anonymity and confidentiality. That sort of language is probably what people imagine. And all those things, of course, are important, and a lot of them are actually embodied in the MRS Code of Conduct. But I think the key thing about having the ethical perspective is that most of those decisions are and should be made by you individually in specific situations. And whereas the 10 Commandments might have some very kind of, useful and kind of obvious kind of laws, they're probably not enough. They're probably a lower bar than we should be aiming for. I mean, I think all of us hopefully aren't going to harm, physically at least, our respondents. We want to aim for something much higher and something much more meaningful. So it's all about decisions you make individually. So what guidance can we get for those situations? What kind of principles or high-level thoughts could help us in kind of making those kind of decisions? What I find really interesting, really helpful, is to think carefully about where the power lies in relationships and in certain situations between us and the respondent. And that really helps focus my mind on what's ethical. Because if you think about power, you're also thinking about vulnerability, and you're also kind of invoking a responsibility. Now, it might seem strange to think about ourselves as powerful. Certainly we don't always feel powerful, I don't think, as we kind of go into that back room after the first group, keen for reassurance that we're doing a reasonably good job, keen for some smiles and so on. We probably seem quite needy. But actually, if you think about it from the respondent's point of view, they're coming into our territory. We have status as the group leader. We're setting the rules. They're in our world. And they're looking to us for approval. Therefore, we do have power, and we need to be ethical about how we use it. But the first step is to be conscious of our power. So we have power. We need to use it benignly. We need to be conscious of it. And when I say conscious of it, I'm not just talking about the big stuff. I'm talking about the tiny cues that people read, sometimes subconsciously, from our body language and our expressions that kind of give approval or disapproval. So we may like to think we'd never be rude to a respondent, for example, but that's not enough, okay? Because just merely averting your gaze might be enough to make someone feel disapproved of or excluded. And we need to be very, very conscious of things we do. The other night I was doing the last group in a project. I'd made my mind up really about what the findings were, but there's this last group we had to do. And then someone started talking, and kind of basically they were contradicting one of the main points, one of the main insights I felt so proud of. And I really didn't want to hear what they were saying. I really wanted them to shut up. And I kind of found myself torn between kind of listening and then kind of turning away slowly. And, you know, I think they must have known that I was not really enjoying what they were saying, because they shut up. And that's to my eternal discredit that that story can be told. I think the other, you know, again, it's about self-awareness. And that self-awareness I just demonstrated came alas too late to actually do anything. But if we think about ourselves as powerful, think about when we have power, then I think that will really help us. And of course the power isn't absolute. We're not kind of dictators or anything like that. You know, and sometimes we feel, as I said earlier, quite weak. And sometimes respondents can not play the game. They can refuse to play, they can be disruptive, make us look bad in front of the respondent. But even in that situation, try, if you can, though you may be slightly goaded by that, try and think what is it about them that's making them behave like that. And sometimes, not always, sometimes it's a personality issue, frankly, but sometimes it will be because maybe they didn't feel validated at the beginning of the group, or maybe they didn't feel they were being listened to in the right way, and there might be things you can do. Even if there aren't, thinking about it in that way, thinking about their vulnerability that might be behind some of that aggression, actually helps us kind of send good vibes to them, which in itself can be quite reassuring. So power is really important. Now, so far I've only talked about respondents, and I think that would be really annoying to some of you, because I've eavesdropped and taken part in quite a few discussions about who we owe ethical duty to. Should it be the client first and foremost, or should it be the respondent first, or is it a mutual thing? But I very consciously do focus on the respondent for a reason I'll tell you in a second. That is not to say in any way that we don't have ethical duties to our clients. Of course we do. We have key ethical duties to produce good work, to be transparent and honest in our dealings with them, etc. But think again about the power. In most situations, they will have the whip hand. They will be the ones who are paying the bill. They will be the ones who we want to impress. A bit like the respondents want to impress us, we want to impress our clients. So thinking about where the power lies, that is why I tend to focus on making sure the respondent is as comfortable and as kind of relaxed and feeling secure as possible, and kind of let the client look after themselves a little bit. And that doesn't necessarily mean, of course, there's no absolute rules here, that clients are all powerful. And the image on the screen there, you're probably wondering why I have an image of Ian Duncan Smith there. He's actually a very indirect client of ours. But on the one hand, on the left-hand side of that image, you know, he is looking quite aggressive and in control. But of course, there are situations where clients, as the right-hand image kind of hopefully reveals, feel quite vulnerable themselves. And in the research process, there can definitely be a backroom dynamic, perhaps when there's a senior client in the room to your client, maybe the marketing director is there, that they actually feel vulnerable as well. So in that case, we should really attend to them in that situation, because that's where the power may lie. But the real point I'd like to make, the most powerful and the most important point I'd like to make, is that any sense of choice between the client and the respondent on who we give most of our kind of concern and kind of compassion to, that's a kind of false choice. Because when we prioritise our relationship with our respondent, the client actually benefits. And our greatest ethical duty to the client is to do good work. And if we place a respondent first and foremost at the centre of our world, they will, for the reason we talked about earlier, they will reveal more about themselves. Insights will flourish and the work will be better. So, I joked earlier on about kind of some of the ethical issues of the black and white days when I first started in research, and you know, incentives and stuff like that were kind of much top of mind. But I think there's a whole host of new ethical issues which I'd like to kind of discuss with you. These are new things, and they're some of them really quite important. They're not just about incentives. By the way, I don't have it in for incentives. I think incentives are important too, but there's some really big stuff coming out there which I'm kind of focusing on, and maybe you are too. So a number of these issues then. I think one of the biggest changes in the dynamics of the industry has been the shift from where, you know, 20 or 25 years ago, most group discussions were called group discussions and weren't called focus groups, but they were actually conducted in the front room of a suburban recruiter. And the idea behind that was that they'd feel comfortable there in a kind of a front room much like their own, which is quite a patronising point of view in a way. And believe me, I got involved in very stilted and uncomfortable group discussions in such environments. But the heart was in the right place. I think what's happened over the last 25 years or so is that the focus shifted to the viewing facility. And along with that, the danger that your focus as a researcher has shifted from the front room, from being present in the room with your respondents, and the temptation and pressure to be in that back room with your clients, making sure they're happy. And I think that has real issues in terms of the ethics, but also for the reason I talked about earlier, the quality of what we're doing. Because we're not in the front room, wholly in the front room, mentally in the front room, as well as physically. We're doing the process of disservice, and in fact the client in the back room of disservice, because we're not creating and investing in that kind of key relationship. I think one of the other things, and this is something I talked about at the MRS yesterday, the idea of qualitative innovation. We've moved from a little bit from kind of depths and group discussions to kind of lots of new techniques, sometimes very, very kind of meaningful and very valuable. But there was a little bit of a danger, I think, in the kind of creating so much theatre that the needs and comfort of the respondents become secondary. And sometimes I think, and some of the conversations I've had with respondents after some of these workshops, or whatever we're calling them, the danger is they feel a bit like they're performing SEALs and they're there to perform. They're not there to chat or to reveal or confide. They're actually there to kind of impress and play a role, and maybe a role they're not necessarily comfortable with. The other thing I'd like to raise here, probably more controversially in terms of new ethical challenges, is behaviour economics. Now, behaviour economics has clearly been a huge boon to the industry in many ways, but there's a certain type of behaviour economist, I think, and therefore some researchers as well, who've kind of adopted a certain sort of language which doesn't, to me, feel completely appropriate to a respectful and an authentic relationship. So there's words like, you know, people saying there's no point talking to anyone, they don't know their own mind, they're unreliable witnesses, kind of, you know, they're kind of idiots who make kind of irrational decisions anyway, all these sort of things. And I think there's some danger there, and I think that probably has some implications for how our relationships with research, with respondents could actually be. People feel those sort of judgments in the room. People are much more sensitive to that kind of invisible kind of energy than people think they are. So what I try and do is always remember that, you know, people aren't just a collection of biases. They are human beings first and foremost, and that's how we should engage in their individuals. And also, and I know some behavioural economists have also highlighted this, it's not just them who have all those biases, the researchers do as well. And we're all out there together, we're all in this together, if you like. We're just as irrational as they are. So let's have no judgment on that level. And I think researchers always need to be careful about how they use their knowledge. And I think sometimes when we're just in the room looking for kind of behavioural biases that perhaps our client can exploit, then that might get us into some kind of interesting ethical area in its own right. So let's look at some actual examples here. And there's a picture of me. It's a cartoon, which is always my best shot, I think. And the question there is, what would Peter do? What would Peter do in these particular situations? And the three situations I'm going to highlight here, two of which I've experienced myself. The third one I haven't, and you'll be relieved to hear that when you see what that last one is. But it'd be quite interesting just to kind of get you thinking about the sort of specific ethical scenarios or situations you might find yourself in. And then maybe I'll kind of humbly, of course, make some points about what I might try and or hope I'd do in those situations. So the first one, and this I think will resonate with a lot of people. You know, imagine there's a very senior client in the room at the back watching the group. And unfortunately, this very senior client has a huge booming laugh, and it becomes clear as probably the wine is glugged or whatever that he's enjoying the group very much, perhaps not necessarily in the way that is particularly complementary to the respondents in the room. So what you know, the respondent will say something quite seriously, and they'll hear the kind of from the back room, they will hear the laughter of that client. Now, just to make it more interesting, imagine also that you have a very close client relationship who's also in that room with their senior client, and they're very nervous and they kind of want their kind of senior client to kind of enjoy the process. So you've got to think about them as well, and there's a power kind of implication there. So what you've got in front of you there, think about the power. You've got this booming client, you've got the respondents who are clearly knowing that they're being laughed at some level, and then you have this kind of fairly vulnerable client in the back room of your own, or, you know, a personal relationship of yours who wants the client to be happy and certainly doesn't want you kind of upsetting the client anyway. So what does one do in that situation? What would Peter do? Well, I was chatting to Ken about this earlier, and he's a far more ethical researcher than I am. He had a very good idea, and I'm going to kind of use this in the future if this happens again. I think what he did in the past was he actually said to the group, he didn't go to the back room and make a fuss, he just said, there's clearly someone really enjoying themselves in the back room. They're really laughing loudly, or words to that effect. And that seemed to do the trick. And I thought that was a very instinctive bit of ethical behaviour by Ken, and I should learn from it. A second one, again, it's a client-focused one. The client wants a quiet respondent ejected from the group because, in their words, they're not earning their incentive. And this is actually something that happened to me a little while ago, not too long ago, in the States, funnily enough, which won't surprise many of you. But effectively, he wanted that client removed. I got a note through the door. She wasn't earning her incentive. Now, I tried my best, of course, being a kind of conscientious and ethical person, to include that person. And, you know, she's just very quiet. And you know, it's a mistake that sometimes I think people make. They think that researchers are all powerful and we can change personality. You know, I did my best, but I was not going to turn this introvert into an extrovert. sometime soon, but I was kind of doing my best to kind of make her feel included, rewarding everything she did say and so on. So when I got to this note, I kind of thought for a minute, and then I pretty much decided quite quickly that'd be the wrong thing to do for a number of reasons. That's my instinct, but I also spent a couple of seconds thinking about it. The first reason was because of the relationship I had with her, the fact that she was trying, she wasn't misbehaving, she wasn't showing off, she was just a quiet person doing her best, and it would be, I think, humiliating. No matter how you did it, there are gentle ways of doing it, more relatively gentle ways, I still think she'd feel a little bit humiliated, and I didn't want to do that to her. That's wrong. But I think on another level as well, it sends out, and this is the reason I actually gave to that client after the group, once I ignored their kind of note. What I actually said to the person behind the mirror was, look, it sends a real message out to the rest of the group. If you evict someone, it makes the power fairly naked and obvious, and makes people feel very uncomfortable. And they end up kind of thinking they have to say certain things, or they themselves will get humiliated or evicted. And he kind of bought that. I don't think he would have bought the first more compassionate reason, but he certainly bought that one in terms of effectiveness. So the third scenario, and do you remember I said that 2 of these I'd experienced myself and the third one I hadn't, but this did come up in a conversation in the office a couple of weeks ago. And that is that someone much younger and better looking than me had kind of felt that they were being flirted at in a group, and they got a note from the respondent left at the desk saying they want to meet them for a drink. It's happened to Ken. I can see he's smiling here, happens all the time for him. But essentially, you know, it's quite a frivolous conversation in a way, because we're not doctors, and we're not teachers, and we're not kind of therapists who have that degree of responsibility. But just talking to people, and the reason I highlight it now, because talking to people in the office, there was some sense that somehow it would be at least potentially wrong to actually follow through on that relationship and take it to its full course. And that was really seemed to be the consensus. And it caught several people out, because they tend to be quite macho kind of guys and kind of like, you know, it's just a laugh, whatever. They actually, the interesting thing, I think, is that they felt that somehow it would be exploitative in some way. And when I try to push on that, they kind of talked about, well, you know, you are in a kind of powerful position. You are kind of, you know, not like a doctor or anything, but there is a kind of advantage you have over your respondents. And if you kind of exploit that, it's a bit tacky, and it's just a little bit kind of unseemly. So I think that our consensus was, fine, if you want to have a friendship, that's absolutely fine. And I do have a couple of friends actually who have been respondents. But, you know, if it's going to go further than that, it doesn't feel right. And I think that's a really important thing to understand and think about. Because what it does, I think, is convey the privileged nature of the relationship. And I think even the kind of office Romeo felt that it would be completely wrong to follow through on that night, at least. So, in these situations then, I think the thing that I try and do, whatever the scenario is think of 2 things to help hopefully guide me in these ethical decisions. One is, as I said earlier, where is the power, and therefore where is the vulnerability? And the second thing that I think about is that favouring the respondent actually favours the client in the long term. And if you really want to do the right thing by your client, then you focus on that relationship and make it as privileged and kind of the quality of it as marked as possible. So sometimes that means seeming to favour or prioritise the weaker respondent. So lastly then, my last kind of page here, and hopefully I've kind of communicated this throughout, but I see very much having an ethical perspective is an aspiration. And it's important to have the aspiration. Whether or not the degree to which you succeed in kind of living up to your ethical standards is another issue, but just having the aspiration and having the mindset to think about people in that way is really important. Behaving ethically is incredibly hard in work as in life, but thinking ethically is a little bit easier. But it's such a valuable thing just in itself. Whatever the output, it actually focuses on the person you are prioritising which is a respondent, and there's all sorts of benefits for investing in that relationship through an ethical framework, and it makes stuff more fun too, I think. So that's really where I want to conclude. I'm going to hand over to Ken for some last wisdom words.
I'm not sure about wisdom words, but thank you very much, Peter. I think that was terrific. And I have to say, I've got a feeling my life has changed forever. So you've clearly worked on me, if nobody else. Thank you all for listening. Hopefully we'll see you again at the next version of the Hub, which we'll keep you informed of as soon as we've got more information. So thank you and goodbye.